Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today online and at the ASU California Center, Broadway, at the historic Herald Examiner Building in downtown LA. With great respect, Zócalo Public Square acknowledges the Yuhaviatum, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Yangna that we now know as downtown Los Angeles. We honor their elders, past and present, and the Yuhaviatum descendants who are part of the Gabrielino Tongva and the Fernandeño Tataviam nations. We recognize that the Tongva are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. As Kuyam, we recognize our responsibility to oblige for care of their land. I'm Bianca Collins. I'm Director of Public Programs for Zócalo Public Square, a unit of Arizona State University Media Enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. You can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org, on podcast platforms and YouTube, so please subscribe for our latest programs. We were founded in 2003, and we are now celebrating our 23rd birthday year. Tonight, to kick off Los Angeles Art Week, we ask, how do museums resist censorship? We're pleased to co-present this program with the Japanese American National Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art. I'll now turn it over to Jim Herr of the Japanese American National Museum.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Let me make sure I can do this correctly. Good evening. Once again, my name is Jim Herr. I'm the director of the National Center for Preservation of Democracy at the Japanese American National Museum, and we're so thrilled to be here tonight. For those of you who may not know much about the Japanese American National Museum, our mission is to promote the understanding and appreciation of America's cultural and ethnic diversity. We do that by sharing the Japanese American experience. We are a national repository of the history of Japanese American community. It was founded by the Japanese American community to be a guardian of history and of memory and to ensure that what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II is never, ever faced again by any other community, and that it is not forgotten or repeated. We are a safeguard for sharing that American story, and that story is more important now than it's ever been. Because our work centers on preserving and protecting the histories that have sometimes been very marginalized, at other times they've been contested, and certainly today they're often politically inconvenient. JANM stands at the very heart of these conversations about museums, about censorship, and the essential role that community organizations and cultural institutions play in protecting truth, the access to that truth, and democratic values. So we are especially grateful to be co-presenting this event this evening with our friends at Zócalo Public Square and with the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Los Angeles. When artists and cultural institutions are confronted with censorship, there is a good chance that Elizabeth Larson will be somewhere in that conversation. Elizabeth is the director of the Arts and Culture Advocacy Program at the National Coalition Against Censorship. A member of Don't Delete Art, she is a writer and a curator, and her advocacy work has been featured in publications including the Art Newspaper, Art in America, The Interlocutor, Transatlantica, and Full Bleed. She regularly speaks on artistic freedom and has done so for institutions such as Amont, Art Table, the University of Texas at Houston, Four Freedoms Park Conservancy, and others. She brings an intellectual curiosity and also intellectual rigor and academic rigor to her work. She received a BA in Human Rights from Bard College, as well as an MA in Curatorial Studies from the Center of Curatorial Studies at Bard College. It is that training that sits at the intersection of ethics and culture and public life. We are so pleased that she is here with us today. She's probably more pleased because she came from New York and she gets to enjoy some of our wonderful weather we're having here in Los Angeles. And we're so grateful that she was actually able to make it out here, because we could not have thought of a more thoughtful and insightful guide for this conversation. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Larison.
Thank you for that introduction, Jim. Good evening, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Larison, and I am the Director of Arts and Culture Advocacy at the National Coalition Against Censorship. And I'm pleased to introduce to you our guests this evening. Please join me in welcoming Devon Akmon, who is the Director of the Michigan State University Museum, where he leads efforts to catalyze the museum as a center for creativity, interdisciplinary inquiry, and public engagement. He has more than 20 years of experience in museums and cultural institutions, with work spanning curation, leadership, organizational development, and community-centered design. Previously, Akmon served as director of the Arab American National Museum and as a senior consultant with the DeVos Institute of Arts and Nonprofit Management. He currently serves as chair of the board of American Alliance of Museums. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ann Burroughs, who is president and CEO of the Japanese American National Museum and an internationally recognized leader in the field of human rights and social justice. She is chair of the International Board of Directors of Amnesty International, the immediate past chair of the International Board of Directors at the immediate past chair of Amnesty International USA, and a former chair of Amnesty International's Global Assembly, which is the organization's highest decision-making body. Burroughs' lifelong commitment to racial and social justice was shaped by her experience as a young activist in her native South Africa, where she was jailed as a political prisoner for her opposition to apartheid. Welcome, Ann. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Hamza Walker, who is a curator, writer, and director of The Brick. Walker has curated dozens of exhibitions, ranging from solo to thematic exhibitions, from the production of new work to career surveys. Prior to his role at The Brick, Walker served as an associate curator director of education at the Renaissance Society, a non-collecting museum of contemporary art on the University of Chicago campus. Walker co-curated the exhibition Kara Walker Unmanned Drone, which is part of Monuments 2025, an exhibition co-presented by The Brick and MOCA that brings together decommissioned Confederate monuments and contemporary artworks. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience that we will be taking questions at the end of the conversation. So for those of you who are here in person, you can text questions to the Zócalo phone number. And if you're watching online, you can submit questions to the live chat on YouTube. Now, without further ado, we can begin our conversation. How do museums resist censorship? After a year like we've had, which has been bookended by constitutionally questionable executive orders, which have turned federal agencies and federal funding for arts and culture into complete crisis, to attacks on the Smithsonian Institution's own curatorial independence, and to the complete restructuring of the Kennedy Center, not just in its leadership, but in the changing of its programs and now its name, it's clear to see where the greatest pressures of this moment are coming from. And with the constant emphasis on celebrating the country's semi-quincentennial in uncritical, optimistic, and solely celebratory terms, in addition to the creation of a garden of American heroes, it's evident what this source of these pressures wants from us as creators and as leaders of institutions and culture. So tonight's questions will aim to chart an understanding of how these pressures manifest at the level of the individual museum, what the stakes are in wagering compliance or resistance. And lastly, what are museums doing quietly, publicly, and what is the value of what they're preserving? What is the value of the work in this moment? So Hamza and Devon, unless otherwise specified, my questions are open to all of you, my core questions, and if I have any follow-up questions that are specifically directed, I'll let you know. But my first question begins as an anecdote, or with an anecdote. Some of you know, I know on this panel that, and hopefully some of you in the audience too, part of the work that my organization did this past year at the National Coalition Against Censorship was the drafting of a nationwide statement of values for art and culture. That statement of values is called Cultural Freedom Demands Collective Courage. And it was largely positioned in response to censorship pressures that artists and cultural institutions across the field were facing. This is a document that I had about 40 co-authors either drafting, giving feedback, or editing in the process. And as I was soliciting feedback about what this document should include, I spoke to the leader of a major American museum, national museum, or no, not national, a major museum, contemporary art, who gave great feedback. It was very kind and generous with their time and thankful for the work I was doing, but made it very clear that no matter how many of their edits I took, if I took all of them, they would not they wouldn't be signing. They wouldn't be signing the statement of values, which largely is about cultural independence and maintaining what you're out there to do. And their reason for doing so was that they were a private museum that didn't overtly rely on a lot of government funding. And so they weren't affected by censorship pressures, was kind of what I was being told. So that brings me to my first question, this little bit of background. I would love to hear about how you each interpret or internalize the current political pressures, either at your home institutions or how you're observing them in the field more broadly. Is it really limited to federal grantees who rely on government funding for a substantial amount of their operating budgets?
I was going to hardly, in answer to the very end of that statement. It's not even, and I don't know, relative to your anecdote, a kind of soft peddling about why they wouldn't sign a statement of that nature. It's, when we talk about censorship, yes, there are pressures, and exerting those pressures is one thing, as opposed to a direct statement from an authority about your not being allowed to do or say something. Mm. And so I would say that that pressure produces a kind of conscious, degrees of conscious or unconscious, becoming conflict averse, right? Not really wanting to, when that pressure is applied, push comes to shove, push comes to love, like not wanting to stand up. And so I think that that's a more, that black and white cases of censorship, you know, as I was painting them with an authority that's coming down and saying you can and can't do this or whatever, that's one thing. Whereas I would say the more gray areas about what is and isn't signed, being able to clearly articulate what you stand for, having moments of moral clarity, right, under those conditions. Just as soon as there are those who would stand up, there are those who soft pedal, or, you know, when that pressure, when they're put to that pressure. Mm-hmm. And
so let me zoom out for a quick second if I can. I mean, I want to really kind of ground us in the moment we're in right now. I mean, I'm speaking mainly from the vantage point of museums, and we've been dealing with all kinds of hot topic issues for a number of years, okay? Last year, something really unique happened. From the executive branch of our government, we heard that museums and universities were the last bastion of woke, which was opening up through direct federal intervention a new type of censorship, I believe. Sure, we've dealt with a lot in the past. We've talked about the culture wars for years. We can go back to Mapplethorpe at the Corcoran in the late 80s. We could talk about the Enola Gay in the mid 90s. What's different, I think, is those were interrogations of so-called morality. And you can unpack that as you will. Where we are today, I believe, is we are facing a direct attack on the institutions themselves with the funding and everything that permeates. And frankly, I think the field and a lot of our peers are unsettled and do not know how to respond to that and are trying to do that in real time. And I mean, we'll go down the rabbit hole on that here today, but I think that is really what's differentiating this moment of having our government coming after an entire field and trying to set examples and using things like the tax exemption status and other things as a means to strong arm these institutions.
Couldn't agree more with all that's been said. And, you know, thank you for bringing up your statement, because I know that JANM, we were one of the museums that signed on very early on. But, you know, I'd like to just sort of, I mean, Devon, I really appreciate your going to the macro, and I'd like to take a little bit to the micro and talk about what we've done, what we did at JANM. So, you know, within 2 weeks of the Trump inauguration last year, our trustees came out with an incredibly strong statement in defense of civil rights, of history and democracy. And for them, it was deeply personal, because most of their parents and their grandparents had been incarcerated during the Second World War. And it was patently clear that the same kind of discrimination that was used to jail their parents and dispossess their grandparents and their parents was about to be launched against everybody else. So for our trustees, it was as much about defending history as it was an act of defiance. And we were the first museum in the country to actually come out with a strong statement, and what felt like the longest time, we were the only ones. And we did it for several reasons. Obviously, the one was in defense of history. The other was because we felt that it was the only way that we could defend the integrity of our institution. But also because nobody stood up for Japanese Americans in 1942 when they were incarcerated. So for us, it was incredibly important that we stand up for other communities who we knew were going to be attacked, and yes, of course they have, but also for other museums in the field who we knew didn't have the luxury to be able to stand up in the way that we did. And I think it's, you know, it's easy for us to sort of, because we took a stand, it's easy for us to say, well, you know, we took a stand. But the fact of the matter, one also has to understand, in the climate that Devon's been talking about and that Hamza's been talking about, is that, you know, for many museums, even in those sort of dark early months, just business as usual felt like an act of courage, because people didn't know what the impact would be and how they would be able to show up and whether they would be able to keep their doors open. So I think it's a spectrum, and we've continued to take a really, really strong position on all of those things. But I think that it's more than, I think that the moral issue is critically important, but I think it's also broadly, and it's not just an attack on history, it's not just attempts to erase history or to subvert science, but it's really, and it goes back to the woke thing, it's this incredibly deep attempt to homogenize culture and to erase history. Because those are, we know, I'll talk about it later on, but we know that those are some of the most vibrant things in any kind of resistance playbook. And certainly we see ourselves as being part of that ecosystem.
Absolutely, and I appreciate your distinguishing like the role of JANM and why it was so easy to come out so hard and say that you would be scrubbing nothing, that you would be standing by everything that you were doing. And in other situations, there are a lot of pressures on cultural institutions. We talk about this a lot, that there's, you know, they're having to weigh their financial viability with their integrity and or serving their audiences and the artists that they work with. One thing in that sort of balance to me that's become clear is that for some institutions, it's like no decision, no choice can be made without some degree of risk. And as culture is now the apparent focus of this administration, my second question for you all is, how do you understand the risks of museums, say, complying in advance or, softening some things versus the risks of doing what they had planned or wanted to do in accordance with their scheduled programs? So how do you and your institutions, or how can the field, reckon with these competing risks? How do you think about that?
Let me start by saying one of the wonderful things about museums is we remain among the most trusted institutions in our nation, and that's saying something at a time when we don't trust a lot of things. Having said that, I think we have an imperative to stay true to our values and the work we do. And unfortunately, again, if you look at history, this prologue, and you kind of see what's happened in the past, not taking action is often the thing that causes the most harm, and we tend to lose that trust. Personally, I believe museums are the perfect forum for these types of debates. Now, how we approach that as institutions is going to look a lot different, but simply just shying away from that, to me, is risking that vital trust that we've built.
Absolutely. I mean, I wholeheartedly concur in the last portion of what you said about that trust having been built, right? So to look towards museums to broker a certain kind of discourse about things that we might know are uncomfortable. Well, where is that going to take place, right? And like what you were saying about people look to museums, places of learning to do that, precisely that kind of work. So, but if I were to hear you, part of what you were saying, Elizabeth, about having this climate forcing one to look at, to be able to respond, essentially, was kind of the under what you were kind of saying, right? And but that situations like this always make me ask, well, what were you doing before? Or like, what was your agenda? What did you believe in? How were you interpreting your mission? What kinds of projects, programming? What was your outlook on the socio-cultural fabric, right? Before all of this went down. So that question about being able to stay true to what it is that you were doing, right? So that there doesn't necessarily have to be this sudden violent, oh my God, we have to respond to this. It's like, and what you were saying earlier, Ann, about, well, just being able to do what it is that you're already doing might be the form of resistance. Right? So.
Absolutely. What I would say also about museums and about trust and about what we've always done and what we've always done well, to my mind, JANM is a cultural history museum. But, we were built by the community to commemorate a very particular period in history, a grave injustice, to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So, yes, we absolutely see ourselves as being a trustworthy museum, but I think museums in general, and to Devon's point, we are first and foremost, we are institutions of trust, but we're completely accountable to the communities that we serve. And if we are really true to what that accountability means, then hopefully we would have been doing all of that programming all along. And I think that that's where the trust starts breaking down. If you're doing that programming all along, that's fine. But when you start getting into the realm of, appeasement, then everything shifts completely. What I would also say for ethnically, culturally specific museums, history museums, art museums, so much of what we do is based in this whole idea of memory. And I'm not talking about nostalgia or remembrance, but it's really about memory. And I think about memory as power, because it is. Because, memory is, it determines who are the holders of history. Whose stories are going to be told? Who's going to tell those stories? And there's enormous power in that. And there's also enormous power in shaping what the future is going to be. So that's a power that we can't afford to give up, and that's a power that is absolutely under attack. And we also have to remember, to Hamza's point, is that authoritarianism never comes just overnight. It happens gradually. And if we aren't aware of it, if we aren't anticipating it, then suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where, oh my God, I'm about to lose my funding. What do I do? How do I do this? How do I respond? And how do I do it in a way that remains true to my... So it's a hell of a difficult situation that museums are in. It's an incredibly difficult situation. As Devon said, we remain the most trusted institution in the country, but we have an enormous responsibility to maintain that trust,
Thank you. No, it's going back to what you were saying about everybody here, about like going back to what the main raison d'etre, the reason for being of what these institutions are, that should be like the guidepost and continuing on as intended. Though in so many ways, I know it's, at least as we've seen, sometimes easier said than done in some circumstances. But so we've established, I guess, how pressures can manifest within ourselves, or in ways that we feel them and try to resist them, and the risks and the pressures on to maintain and maintain that level of commitment to what these institutions do. I now want to talk a little bit about how we navigate forward then. One thing I lament a lot about in the beat that I cover of art censorship is we always hear about when it goes wrong. Right? We always hear when a mistake has been made. It's very sensational. It's like interesting, right? But also it's always focused on the failure. Whereas when you have an excellent exhibition that navigates a lot of difficult things, you're lucky if you get a good review and some good attention, but it doesn't get the same level of, it's not as hot. So
we've all had those failures.
And successes. And that's what this next question is. So I know you've all navigated different difficult things in difficult ways. What are some of the ways that you see yourselves or even peers in the field doing the good work of resisting censorship in the current moment, even if quietly?
Yeah, it's just in thinking about monuments, having worked on the exhibition for 8 years.
Wow.
We saw a president come, we saw a president go, we saw a president return. We saw that happen at the level of municipalities, where we would have negotiations with one mayor, and then there would be an election, and then we'd have to renegotiate the loan with another administration over that period of time. But the not knowing what the context would be or the backdrop for the exhibition was, in part, a saving grace, in a sense, where over that period of time, it took on a life of its own, so that by the time it went to open, the extent to which it was being read as a reaction against the current climate, that was a problem for me, because it wasn't crafted. It wasn't. That was the last thing that it was 8 years. So to have it suddenly be reduced to a reactionary impulse was something of a I felt like a rub, let's say, but that would speak to what the ability, if I even frame it as turning one's back on, that already puts it in relationship to a given power structure, which I don't want to do, right? It's about figuring out what it is that you believe in and what you think is important to say, and then to continue the work needed to do that, right? And to find the resources and to trust in artists and what it is that they want to do. And that's a thing all unto itself. Right, and to do that and to follow it out wherever it is that it's going to take you, right, and not in any as again, in terms of as a reactionary kind of thing. And I think that I would want to believe that at the end of the day, that shows in the work, in the show, that it actually is a much more complex, there's like a lot of things going on inside of it that are something other than, yes, they could be read in relationship to the current administration, but there's something more going on, right? This is much deeper and much longer, has a much greater breadth than this executive order or that executive order or this set of distractions. So
I think, let me just start by saying I think an event like this is an act of resistance. I mean, this is what museums do really well. I mean, we've got the Democracy Center at JANM. I mean, having dialogue is kind of what is beautiful about these institutions, and I would like to just quickly share my gratitude to the two individuals I'm sharing a stage with to my left here. I mean, the fact that this exhibition, I appreciate that context, but the fact that this is still being presented is an act of defiance, I believe. And the work you're doing at JANM is so value-driven and inspirational. I mean, I think there are institutions like these that are out there doing very bold things. I think there are institutions that are doing the work, but very quietly. But where I think the biggest gains are, and I think people are starting to figure this out right now, is that we go further together, right? And how we build coalitions. And I think right now you're starting to see museums and libraries and all types of other institutions saying, how do we do this together? We have more muscle together, we're stronger together, and we are so foundational to civic society and democracy, we must do this together.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I know. I was just taking heart in what you were saying, just in thinking about, it's particularly along the lines of, well, not necessarily. I was going to say culturally specific museums, right? In a way, but yeah, maybe. But to realize that in terms of stories to tell, things to learn, things to know, and there's a power in knowing these things. And maybe I sound naive against the forces that are out there, but you can't shut it down. I mean, this has been going on. It's like, to feel like, no, the kind of stories, histories, narratives upon which JANM is founded and what it has to say is bedrock kind of material, and not just in a culturally specific sense, but to the nation's history, right? Those kinds of chapters. And I want to feel the same way about your museum, right? That these are things you can't stop this. I mean, you can, try and pull a plug, and you can try, but it's in terms of as a certain kind of bulwark, at least, and I want to feel like that's what drives us to do the work that it is that we do. And we find fortitude in knowing and feeling like it's like, no, again, trying to shut off the valve or turn it off or shut it down. But the idea also that there is strength in coalition building and knowing that there are so many other stories. You can't. There are so many stories that need to be told, that are being told, and there's that much more to tell, that there is, again, a kind of strength, or I want to believe, I take solace and fortitude, in that.
I see our work as, museum practitioners, as artists or whatever, as being sort of so centered in the First Amendment. And we have an incredible, going forward, we have an incredible obligation to defend that. But part of defending that is actually living it every day and living in the work that we're doing. Because as we do that, we are, museums we're so deeply embedded in civic infrastructure. We are hubs for community. And that notion of coalition, for many museums, it's new. But, for museums like ours, it's what we do. I keep talking about, you go to, if anybody's in the corporate, non-profit or whatever, you go through strategic planning processes and there's always the competitive advantage. Well, for us, it's the collaborative advantage. How can we collaborate? How can we collaborate deeply? Because that's how we're stronger and that's how everybody is stronger and that's how the art is stronger. That's how history is stronger. That's how memory becomes an act of not just a resilience, which creates and holds communities together, but also becomes a sort of act of resistance. So for me, it's a very powerful thing. And the more we can do that in community, in coalition, in collaboration, the stronger we all are. And that for me is, and I also don't want us, and we get so caught up in this whole thing about, the difficulty of the moment and the challenges, and we sort of forget that we forget about the joy, and we forget about the joy, that the joy is at the heart of art, that joy is at the heart of culture, and so much of history and preserving the history, even the difficult history. There's the joy that comes through, and we can't lose that because we need that, and we need to build on that, because if we don't have that, we aren't going to be able to survive through the long haul.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more.
When you cited the First Amendment, and it also made me think the First Amendment is actually kind of a double-edged sword at the moment, it feels like, right? Because it feels like it's being weaponized by a right that wants to say, no, we're the victims here. We're the ones who are being silenced by that last bastion of woke. So what do you do when it's like, the use of the First Amendment to say, I can say whatever it is that I want, right? I mean,
And so can I.
I have the freedom, the freedom to offend, in a way. But that's, yeah, right. I mean, is it a question of fighting fire with fire in that respect? But I just wanted to make note of the use of the First Amendment. Is this the way it's being bandied about? Let's say, is just put me, I just feel a certain a wariness and a sadness that I can't. There's no solace there, or in some sense. So,
well, we need to claim it back.
Oh.
Yeah.
We need to reclaim it. We can't lose it. Mm-hmm. We can't lose it because it's so precious.
Yeah.
It's so precious.
But also the way that it's being claimed right now, as you comment, Hamza, it's very coded and it's very sided, and the way that it's supposed to be enacted and protected is broadly, so that everybody has the ability to pursue their own thoughts and inquiries and expressions as according to their pursuits. I wanted to pick back up on the comment you were speaking to, Anne, about finding joy. That's really important, obviously, and so is the hard work. There's often, I think, particularly now in a year like we've had, there's a lot of trepidation around sensitive subjects. And maybe, I can think of a lot of, as we were talking about, a lot of museums plan years in advance for their shows. I can imagine there might be a museum, if they're 2 years out, now thinking about what show they were going to be doing in 2 years. And if they're between a show that's, one that's likely to draw controversy if things keep going as they're going, versus one that's, let's say, like more of a crowd pleaser, a little more anodyne, they might be more prone to find safety in that happens to be free of any of the forbidden topics. And I wanted to ask what you all think about this. Is this like merely a strategy for staying alive? Like if presuming both of these shows are ones that they would have considered otherwise, is this self-censorship, or is this just how museums operate if they're weighing these kinds of balances?
I think all the above.
Fair.
No, I mean, I think, again, just kind of grounding us a little bit. I mean, post-COVID, museums are in a difficult spot. Put aside the challenges that we're facing around censorship. I mean, we are dealing with the rise of this immersive economy and how people are spending their leisure time, and people are getting algorithms feeding, watch this movie, do this next. So we're already, from our business model, and for some museums, that very much is big kind of blockbuster shows and things that are meant to just alleviate, find some joy, to say that, but others are want to be kind of a forum for the topics of our time. And that too runs risk. But, there's also the challenges, how we're preparing our staffs to facilitate that kind of dialogue. I mean, we don't want to just throw stuff up on the walls. We want to have conversations like we're having here today. So I think it's all of that. And, how we balance a mix of that in our programmatic portfolio is going to be a challenge. But, you know, I had the really good fortune of being involved into the circle of Jewish museums here in the U.S. Dealing with anti-Semitism. And I have to say, as an Arab American, I felt really honored to be welcomed into that dialogue to give some perspective. But a lot of the challenge is exactly what you're alluding to. We build 3-4 years out. You know, so how are we creating space to be more nimble to adapt to what's happening in society? And frankly, I think my humble perspective is we need to build some of that into our programmatic schedule. You know, we can't be so wedded to this is what we have planned for 5 years and not able to adapt to what's happening in the world. And I think we have that responsibility as it goes back to this notion of trust, of building that in, some elasticity that allows us with our empowered staff to address topics that are relevant for our communities. Because frankly, we're losing third spaces as a society. Where are these conversations taking place? Online? And that can be, as we all know, a bit vitriolic.
I was just listening.
I just killed the party.
No, it was such a good answer.
Not at all, not at all.
I mean, we're, you know, I mean, it's quite nice to be, you know, working at the Brick, a small nonprofit alternative space. So we're very nimble. So we're, the ways in which we're able to respond, and not only to the current climate, but at the same time, these kinds of issues are our stock in trade, especially as alternative spaces developed, you know, out of the 70s and then into the 1980s in terms of a certain kind of sociocultural paradigm shift, right? So in terms of brokering discourses about diversity, you know, class, in terms of homelessness, the AIDS pandemic, you know, sexuality and gender, that spaces of like the Brick were kind of on the front lines of you know, kind of brokering that discussion. But again, so these are exactly the kinds of circumstances and conditions that we address historically, and climates in which we kind of, you know, thrive to some sad to say.
Thank you. I think I might have time for one more question before we transition to the Q&A. It's really clear right now that art and culture are powerful influences in society, which is why there are efforts to try to control them. I wanted to know how you see the role of the museum and art and culture more generally in a dramatically changing world, both technologically, politically, and otherwise.
Okay, I'm being ignorant. And despite that, in some sense, I probably have the most conservative answer for it, which for all the changes technologically, I you know, in engagement with works, as spaces of museums, galleries, going and looking at artwork as spaces and places for a very particular kind of reflection. And this is, and again, not to sound reactionary in relationship to, you know, the screen and social media and online culture. There is all of that. But as far as looking, thinking, feeling, looking, feeling, thinking again, you know, I don't think, I want to believe that people still, that there is a desire to do that, and at particular times, a hunger for what it is that we have to offer. You know, despite whatever kinds of trends, you know, like you were painting the business model for museums, having the attention economy, and have to compete for those things. Sometimes I really do think that when we become anxiety-ridden or focused on that we actually lose sight of what it is that we do, and aren't able to stand up for that very thing, right? Is like, okay, all right, I don't want to reduce this to a 30-second soundbite. I don't want to have to compete with those things. This is what it is that we do, and this is what it is that we have on offer, period, right? And this is not that, you know? And to be able to stand up for that and make arguments for that and why it needs support is important. So, you know, even in terms of contemporary art, I don't want to kind of fall prey to having to compete with or really think about, you know, I don't know, a certain kind of adaption for adaption's sake, you know, to address those kinds of concerns in a changing world.
You know
Some
what?
things stand still. It's okay.
And I think that's good. For me, you know, art and culture will always be at the heart of who we are. You know, it will always be at the heart of humanity. And it will always be, well, I hope that we will always have the ability to use that to make sense of our world and to be able to communicate and to find the commonality in that language. So for me, that will always be there because it is part of who we are. But perhaps the method will change. Perhaps the delivery will change, and I think that that's also okay. You know, it may not from a sort of purist perspective. You know, we might look at it and sort of, you know, make our own judgments. But the fact of the matter, if those are the mediums that speak to a broad group of people, and if those are the mediums that inspire an artist, how an artist should create, or the medium that they should use, then I think that that's also fine, and it's good. And we should celebrate that, and not be afraid of it.
Yeah.
But I think when we start forcing it in any of those directions, then it ceases to be a language that we can understand.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, and I need more of that context, or not context, but perspective in how I approach some of the new things. I'm also kind of like you, Hamza. I want the slow experience. I want to see it on its own terms. Thank you all. It is time for us to take questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. If you have a question, you can come line up over here beside me. I'm going to start with a question that was texted to us from someone in the audience. This panel has focused on resisting censorship from the outside. I want to ask about tensions internally to the work. When does free speech come into conflict with, for example, social justice, as happened at Pan America in 24? Can there be artists whose free expression is hard to defend? Historically, the limits of free speech are harm and falsity. Do we experience these or other limits in museum practice?
That's quite a complex question. I'm not quite sure where to start with that. I'm going to look at Hamza again.
Well, no, I mean,
To take the lead, but what I would say is that sort of internally, of course, those tensions exist. Of course they exist. I think that, you know, we've been extraordinarily lucky where I work, we don't have those, because there is this sort of deep sense of commitment to the work that we do. So there's not a point where we feel that we have to censor ourselves, or there's been a point where an opinion or a perspective is not valued or centered. But I know that tension, of course, it exists. We see it existing. We see it existing all the time, and the way that it plays out is different from institution to institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's to be aware. Sometimes art, it goes places. It can be tough. And the role of institutions, again, in kind of mediating or trying to frame some things that are very, very hot and very difficult to tackle. But sometimes to think critically about, I mean, there's the work, then there's what the work might be doing. is the work, in fact, mapping a set of thresholds or limit case, right, about, calling attention to, making us conscious of limits or thresholds that we weren't aware of or were having difficulty in articulating, right? And kind of trying to move around, sometimes you have to, go beyond that threshold in order to call attention to that very threshold. And it can be hard, perhaps, to defend artwork or something that is doing that, that might have to take a kind of position in an extreme case in order to do that. But to, again, understand that, and to think that what might be a threshold in, to quote Raymond Pettibone in one of his drawings, or no, the name of one of his zines, Up the Threshold. Today's threshold might not be tomorrow's threshold, right? We could look back and go, it's like, oh my God, that was such a risky and a risque thing to do. But what is work sometimes that, again, challenges that for the sake of making a mirror, crafting a mirror of what are our values, what do we believe, and sometimes we aren't able to see those things, without some kind of discomfort. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, this is a big question. I agree with Ann. I'll simply say, and I'll kind of do a little navel gazing. I'll pick on my own museum. I mean, we try to address really big topics. In the last couple of years, we've done surveillance, climate change. We have a show up right now on disinformation and how disinformation spreads in our society. And I would say internally as a staff, we have really robust and rigorous debates, and that is healthy. I mean, there's a moral responsibility. If you're going to put big things out there that are timely and impacting society, you should have debate. Mm-hmm. I think we have a shared value at the end of the day where we coalesce around what we want to do. But I think the most important thing is how we are creating space for this work once we go forward. Again, putting up an exhibition is great. I think that's the easiest part of it, to be frank. I think, programming, what does your programming look like? That cascades and scaffolds this kind of work. What are you doing to prep your staff to facilitate the dialogue? If you want, that's the beauty of museums, right? We keep talking about shrinking democratic spaces in our society. We see that. It's harder to find spaces to go and just converse around things that matter. And if we, I believe, as museums want to do that, we must really build our capacities to have these types of dialogue. And I think that's the hardest part of this work. It requires our institutions to be vulnerable in a way that we've been the expert for so darn long. It's hard to do this work, and we're trying to figure it out in real time. But that's my short answer to that. But we're learning. Humbly, we are learning as we do this work.
Thank you.
Sarah Cochran, I think one of the things that's interesting is the question of money. And I would like to broaden this discussion a little bit to talk about how we respond to larger issues such as the morality of our trustees, Leon Black being of MoMA being the worst case scenario. How do we respond to the desire for clean money to make exhibitions?
Mm-hmm.
That's excellent question. And we've seen all too often, unfortunately, how that is compromised and how that is driven by donors. And I think it's a very serious issue, and it's something that we should never do. That having been said, it's easy for us to say it because we have the most extraordinarily courageous trustees they're also extraordinarily generous. So we've not had that kind of level of compromise, but it doesn't matter whether the pressure is coming from a donor or whether the pressure is coming from the federal government. If a donor is withholding money because you're not presenting exhibitions that they feel are important, it's no different from the federal government, rescinding, like they did in our case, almost $700,000 worth of funding that had been already awarded. And it's so there's, to my mind, really the principle is really not that different. It's not that different. I mean, that's why sort of independence, we've talked about that, how we need to retain that independence, how we need to be accountable because we are part of that sort of civic infrastructure. And, you know, democracy is such a critical piece of that. And our role in that as being a place that's open to everybody, is so critical, you know, where thought can thrive, where dialogue can thrive, and to have that compromised by anybody, whether it's a donor or whether it's the federal government, is just unacceptable.
Right, and I'm glad you said that, Ann. One of my thoughts for this evening in terms of censorship, another thread of thought, I guess, was follow the money in some sense. But I think there's a big distinction, and you pointed it out, Ann, between a Leon Black, right? And that's a question of like taking sin money, right? Do you take, you know, you run an arts organization, do you take money from alcohol, tobacco, which is quite different than what you're saying about there's no difference between a trustee who will withhold money because they don't like the position that you are taking with a given exhibition and the federal government. Right, so I would make a distinction between those two issues about following the money. But what you're saying about, and even to what you were saying, Devon, about not institutional preparedness, not trust, that your board. This is, you know, one of your primary audiences, right? Your supporters, and what kind of trust and what kind of relationship do you have with those donors, right? Where that trust won't break down despite differences over particular issues, and you want to believe that, you know. That can be understood within the spectrum of things that an institution will present or do, right? That's a kind of a given. Some things you'll be behind 100%. Some things you'll be behind 80%. Some things you'll be behind a lot less, you know, for different reasons, right? So to understand and have a full perspective or picture of how institutions operate, what it is that they do, the spectrum of things that they offer, so that just because there's one or something in there that touches a nerve, that doesn't suddenly turn into a situation where the funding is then, you know, weaponized or held hostage.
All right, this is the last question we'll have time for. We got lots of text questions in from the audience, so thanks everyone. All right, this is, of course, not the first time we've had censorship issues in the US history, and perhaps not the first time you all personally have experienced it. Do any of you have insight on how censorship has been resisted in the past, successfully or unsuccessfully, and how we might learn those lessons and apply them today?
Well, again, I think that's a really good question. Thanks to the individual who asked that. I do think, you know, again, going back to the Corcoran and Mapplethorpe, I think, you know, that had a huge impact on curatorial approaches that are still being felt today. So I think that's an example of one institution's struggle and how a field has evolved. I think the biggest thing that is different today than perhaps that is a full-on assault against an industry. You know, and that is what is so unsettling right now from my vantage point, is how we have this weaponization to decenter that trust. And I think that is the piece that makes it a little harder for me to answer that, because we're trying to figure that point out. But again, that goes back to why I think coalition building is so important. A dear mentor of mine just passed away, Ismail Ahmed, who was central to helping to build the Arab American National Museum outside of Detroit. And he used to always say, when you don't have money, you have friends. And I've used that as a guiding principle to this day.
Well, I have a very perhaps more simple and direct response than Devon's very eloquent response, which is the example here to my left, your right. In reading what JANM did, we scrubbed nothing they instantly, it's very nice to be reminded that, you can have a hero, right? But one, to me, that was an order of some shit. Sorry, I forgot. We can't do that. It's so upsetting. But in terms of the depth of the feeling, but the thing is like, it doesn't happen without sacrifice. You have to stand up and you have to have courage. And when people do that, that becomes exemplary. Do you have that in you? And so to have Ali get up, and say, it's like, take the belt. You want the belt, take the championship. That's not going to change anything, right? To be able to, with a kind of clarity to know when that situation presents itself. And to me, that's not necessarily that's just a more general kind of life lesson, to follow, and not necessarily unique to censorship per se. But I think that will always be the case, whether it was the culture wars of yore or the climate we find ourselves in. So.
It too will pass. I do believe that. I do believe that. It's just the degree to which we build our resilience in the process, because it will pass. That pendulum will swing back. And we need to be ready for it. We weren't ready for authoritarianism. We have to be ready for what's going to come afterwards, because it will change. It too will pass.
Let's hope it passes quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. It's time for us to close. Devon, Ann, Hamza, thank you for your contributions to this incredible conversation. Thank you to Zócalo Public Square, the Japanese American National Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art for co-presenting this program. A summary of the program will be made available on Zócalo's website in the coming days, as well as special interviews with all of the panelists and me. Please subscribe to Zócalo's newsletter, podcast, and social media for more great conversations, and be sure to visit the Monuments exhibition on View with the Brick and MOCA until May 3rd, 2026. We invite our in-person audience to continue the conversation at our reception right here in the event center with light bites and beverages. Please join me in thanking our guests.